Chapter 1. The Weeping Man. The knock at the Henderson family's door came at 10:15 p.m. on a rain-soaked Thursday evening. 3 polite raps that barely carried over the sound of water cascading from their broken gutters. Margaret Henderson looked up from her knitting, needles pausing mid-stitch as she glanced toward her husband Robert, who was dozing in his recliner with the evening news playing softly on their old television. "Bobby," she whispered, not wanting to wake their twin daughters sleeping upstairs. "Someone's at the door." Robert stirred, his reading glasses sliding down his nose as he blinked away sleep. At 62, he moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose back had betrayed him one too many times, but he still insisted on answering the door whenever strangers called after dark. The man standing on their porch was tall and gaunt, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to hold depths of sorrow Margaret had never seen in another human being. His clothes were expensive but rumpled, as if he'd been traveling for days without rest. Rain dripped from his dark hair, but he made no move to seek shelter or hurry inside. "I'm so sorry to bother you this late," the stranger said, his voice cultured and soft, with just a hint of an accent Margaret couldn't place. "My car broke down about a mile up the road, and my cell phone has no signal. I was wondering if I might use your telephone to call for assistance." Robert's natural kindness overrode his wife's growing unease. "Of course, coming out of the rain. Phone's right there in the kitchen wall." As the stranger stepped across their threshold, Margaret noticed several things that made her stomach tighten with inexplicable dread. His shoes were muddy, but not with the red clay common to their area. The mud was black, almost tar-like, and it seemed to cling to the hardwood floor in patterns that reminded her of claw marks. His breathing was strange too, coming in short, controlled bursts as if he were fighting some internal battle. "Thank you," the man said, but instead of moving toward the phone, he stood in their entryway with his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His knuckles were white with strain, and Margaret could see his whole body trembling. "I need you to know that I'm truly, deeply sorry for what's about to happen." Robert frowned, taking a step back. "What do you mean?" The stranger's face crumpled, and tears began streaming down his cheeks. "I tried to resist. God knows I've tried. I've driven for 3 days without stopping, trying to get somewhere isolated, somewhere I couldn't hurt anyone. But the hunger, it's too strong now. The moon is too close." "Sir, I think you should leave," Margaret said, rising from her chair with her knitting needles still clutched in her hands. "I can't," the man sobbed, his voice breaking with genuine anguish. "It's already starting. I can feel the change beginning, and once it starts, there's no stopping it. I'm so sorry. I'm so very sorry." The transformation began in his eyes, the brown irises bleeding away to reveal something golden and predatory. His breathing changed from controlled gasps to deep, animalistic pants. The expensive suit began to strain against muscles that were expanding and reshaping beneath the fabric. "Oh God," Robert whispered, reaching for his wife's hand. "Margaret, run! Get the girls and run!" But it was far too late for running. The stranger's apologies continued even as his face elongated into something that belonged more in nightmares than in their cozy living room. His tears mixed with saliva as his mouth filled with teeth designed for tearing flesh, and his words became increasingly distorted as his vocal cords restructured themselves. "I'm sorry," he kept repeating, even as his fingernails extended into claws that shredded his sleeves. "I'm so terribly sorry." The lights went out suddenly, whether from his thrashing or some supernatural effect of the transformation, Margaret never knew. In the darkness that followed, there were sounds she would take to her grave if she lived to see morning. Sounds of fabric tearing, of furniture splintering, of Robert calling her name before his voice was cut short. But through it all, She could hear the creature that had been a weeping man continuing to apologize in a voice that grew less and less human with each passing second. Even as it destroyed everything she loved, some part of its consciousness remained aware enough to feel remorse for what it was doing. The last thing Margaret Henderson heard before unconsciousness claimed her was a howl that seemed to contain all the sorrow in the world, echoing through the night like a lament for innocence lost. When the authorities found the house the next morning, called by neighbors who had heard the disturbance, they discovered a scene that would haunt the small town for years to come. The official report spoke of a wild animal attack, possibly a bear or large dog, though no tracks were found and no such animal was known to inhabit the area. The only survivor was found 3 days later, wandering in a state of complete catatonia, 20 miles from her home. Margaret Henderson never spoke coherently again, spending her remaining years in a care facility where she would sometimes weep uncontrollably and whisper apologies to empty air, as if she were channeling the remorse of the creature that had destroyed her world. Chapter 2: Hollow Regrets. 3 weeks later and 200 miles north, the same stranger appeared at the door of the Morrison farmhouse just as the family was finishing their evening prayers. Janet Morrison answered the knock while her husband David was still helping their teenage son Mark with his algebra homework at the kitchen table. The man looked worse than before, if such a thing were possible. His expensive clothes had been replaced with items that appeared stolen or scavenged, ill-fitting and stained. The hollow look in his eyes had deepened, as if something essential was being carved away from his soul with each passing day. But he still knocked, still asked permission, still retained enough humanity to observe the social protocols that separated civilization from chaos. "I'm sorry," he said simply when Janet opened the door, no longer bothering with elaborate explanations about broken cars or dead cell phones. "I'm sorry for what I'm about to do." This time, the apology felt rote, mechanical, as if he were reciting lines from a play he'd performed too many times. The tears were there, but they seemed forced, squeezed out by conscious effort rather than welling up from genuine emotion. Janet tried to slam the door, but the stranger's foot was already across the threshold. Not forcing his way in exactly, but positioned so that she couldn't shut him out without a physical confrontation she was clearly unprepared for. "David," she called to her husband. "David, come here." But David Morrison was already moving, grabbing the hunting rifle from the gun cabinet in the hallway. He'd heard about the Henderson family, read the newspaper reports, and listened to the speculation that had consumed their small farming community for weeks. When he saw the stranger standing in his doorway, some primal instinct told him exactly what he was facing. "Get away from my family," David said, raising the rifle with practiced ease. The stranger nodded sadly, as if he'd expected this response. "I understand. I would do the same in your position, but bullets won't stop what's coming. Nothing stops it once the moon calls." He looked up through the open door at the nearly full moon hanging in the clear October sky, and his shoulders began to shake, but this time, the trembling didn't seem to be from grief. It was anticipation, barely controlled excitement that he was trying desperately to suppress. "I used to be a professor," the stranger said, his voice taking on a conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier sobbing. "Philosophy at a small college in Vermont. I had a wife, 2 children, a tenure-track position. I thought I understood the nature of human consciousness, the relationship between mind and body. The transformation was beginning again, but more slowly this time, as if he were savoring the process rather than fighting it. His breathing became deeper, more controlled, and Margaret noticed that he was no longer crying. "A curse found me 6 months ago," he continued, his voice growing rougher as his vocal cords began to change. "A camping trip in the Adirondacks. Something in the woods that shouldn't have existed. I thought I could contain it, study it, find a cure through rational analysis. David pulled the trigger, the rifle's report echoing through the farmhouse like thunder. The bullet struck the stranger's center mass, spinning him around and slamming him against the doorframe. Blood blossomed across his stolen shirt, but he remained standing. "I was wrong," he said, looking down at the wound with what appeared to be mild curiosity. "There is no cure, no containment, only acceptance." The change accelerated then, muscle and bone reshaping themselves with wet, organic sounds that seemed to fill the entire house. But this time, there were no apologies. Only a low, rumbling growl that suggested anticipation rather than remorse. Mark Morrison tried to run for the back door but made it only halfway across the kitchen before something that was no longer entirely human brought him down. David emptied his rifle into the creature, each shot producing spurts of blood but no apparent pain or even acknowledgement. In the chaos that followed, Janet Morrison discovered that terror could indeed stop the human heart, though whether it was fear or the creature's claws that ultimately claimed her life would never be determined. The creature that had once been a philosophy professor worked through the Morrison family with methodical efficiency, no longer driven by uncontrollable hunger but by something that resembled predatory calculation. It fed, but not frantically. It killed, but without the frenzied desperation that had marked its earlier attack. When the transformation reversed itself near dawn, the man who remained among the carnage no longer wept. He simply gathered what useful items he could find, checked his reflection in the farmhouse mirror to ensure he looked presentable enough for social interaction, and began walking toward the next town. Behind him, the Morrison farmhouse stood silent in the growing daylight, its windows dark and its doors standing open to reveal glimpses of the horror within. It would be days before anyone thought to check on the family, and by then, the stranger would be long gone, following back roads and abandoned highways toward his next appointment with the moon. Chapter 3. Fading Humanity. The Carpenter family lived in a modest split-level house on the outskirts of Millbrook, a town small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business but large enough to support a small police force and a volunteer fire department. When the stranger knocked on their door on Halloween night, little Amy Carpenter was upstairs getting ready for trick-or-treating while her parents finished dinner dishes in the kitchen. Tom Carpenter answered the door, expecting to see costumed children, but found instead a man who looked like he'd been living rough for weeks. His hair was unkempt, his clothes wrinkled and stained, and there was something in his eyes that made Tom instinctively step back. "I'm sorry," the stranger said, but the words came out flat and emotionless, like someone reading from a script they'd long since grown tired of performing. "This will be unpleasant." There was no request for help this time, no elaborate story about car trouble. The social niceties that had marked his earlier appearances were being stripped away, leaving behind something that retained human speech but had forgotten why such courtesies mattered. "Excuse me," Tom said, starting to close the door. The stranger pushed past him with casual strength, no longer waiting for invitations or permission. He walked into the Carpenter living room and stood in the center of the space, looking around with the detached interest of someone evaluating real estate. "Nice house," he observed. "Good bones, the smell of a happy family." He inhaled deeply, as if sampling a fine wine. "Those are the best ones." "The happiness makes the fear more intense." Linda Carpenter emerged from the kitchen with a dish towel in her hands, saw the stranger, and immediately understood that something was very wrong. "Tom, who is this? What does he want?" "I want to change," the stranger said simply. "The moon is full tonight, and I've learned to time my visits accordingly. It's more convenient for everyone involved." He began removing his clothes with methodical precision, folding each item and placing it on their couch as if he were a guest preparing for a swim. Tom grabbed a poker from the fireplace, but the stranger didn't seem concerned by the weapon. "I used to fight it," he said conversationally as he unbuttoned his shirt. Used to think I could resist the transformation through sheer willpower. Then I thought I could control where and when it happened, minimize the damage. But I've learned something important over the past few months. Get out of our house, Linda said, backing toward the stairs where Amy was still getting ready. I've learned that resistance is futile, the stranger continued, ignoring her completely. The beast and I, we're not separate entities fighting for control. We're partners, collaborators. He gives me strength and purpose, and I give him opportunities. The change began more smoothly this time, as if the man and creature had indeed learned to work together. His muscles expanded without the agonizing stretching that had marked earlier transformations. His bones lengthened and reshaped themselves with fluid grace rather than violent convulsions. "Daddy?" Amy's voice called from the top of the stairs. "Who's downstairs?" "Stay in your room," Tom shouted, raising the poker. But the creature that had been a man was already moving, no longer constrained by human reflexes or limitations. What happened next was swift and efficient. The creature had learned from its previous encounters, understanding now how to minimize its own exposure while maximizing the terror of its victims. It had studied human psychology during its months of wandering, observing how fear could be cultivated and harvested like any other crop. Tom's weapon proved as useless as David Morrison's rifle had been. Linda's attempt to reach her daughter was cut short before she made it halfway up the stairs. And Amy, despite her father's warnings, had crept to the top of the staircase to see what the commotion was about. The creature looked up at her with eyes that still held a glimmer of human intelligence, and for a moment, something almost like recognition passed between them. Then it smiled, revealing rows of teeth that had never existed in any earthly predator, and began to climb the stairs with deliberate slowness. Amy ran, but there was nowhere to go in the small house. Her parents' screams had already stopped, replaced by sounds that no child should ever hear. When the creature finally cornered her in her bedroom, surrounded by Halloween decorations and stuffed animals, it paused to study her terror with what could only be described as academic interest. "Please," Amy whispered, clutching a small teddy bear to her chest. "Please, don't hurt me." The creature tilted its massive head, considering her request with apparent seriousness. For a moment, Amy thought she saw something human flicker in its golden eyes, some remnant of whoever this monster had once been. Then the moment passed, and the creature's smile widened into something that contained no mercy whatsoever. When the sun rose on November 1st, the man who had once been a philosophy professor walked away from the Carpenter house without looking back. He no longer felt the need to inspect his work or feel remorse for what he'd done. The transition from human to monster and back again had become as natural as breathing, and the emotional weight that had once crushed him had been replaced by something much more dangerous. Anticipation. Chapter 4. The Hunt Begins. By December, the stranger had stopped pretending to be anything other than what he was. When he knocked on the door of the Williams family's cabin deep in the Adirondack Mountains, he was smiling before anyone answered. "Good evening," he said cheerfully when Sarah Williams opened the door. "Lovely night for a hunt, don't you think?" Sarah took one look at his grinning face and tried to slam the door, but he caught it effortlessly with one hand. His strength was increasing even in human form, as if the months of transformation were bleeding over into his normal existence. Now, he said with mock disappointment, "that's not very hospitable. I've come such a long way to visit with you." The Williams family had chosen their remote cabin specifically to escape the kind of violence that plagued more populated areas. Robert Williams was a freelance writer who'd grown tired of city life, and he'd convinced his wife and teenage daughter to join him in what he called authentic living. The cabin had no cell phone service, no internet, and the nearest neighbor was 15 miles away. It was, In other words, perfect for the stranger's purposes. "What do you want?" Sarah demanded, though she'd already guessed the answer. "Entertainment," the stranger replied, pushing his way inside with casual force. "It's been 3 weeks since my last encounter, and I'm finding that the anticipation makes everything so much more enjoyable." Robert emerged from the back bedroom where he'd been working on his latest manuscript, took one look at the intruder, and immediately understood the gravity of their situation. "Sarah, get Rachel. Get her, and run." "Oh, but that would spoil the fun," the stranger said, settling into Robert's favorite armchair as if he owned the place. "Besides, where would you run to? We're 20 miles from the nearest town, and the temperature outside is well below freezing. You die of exposure long before you reached help." He was right, and they all knew it. The Williams family had chosen isolation for its peace and solitude, never considering that the same remoteness that protected them from modern life stresses would also cut them off from any hope of rescue. "The moon won't be full for another 3 hours," the stranger continued conversationally. "That gives us time to get acquainted. Tell me about yourselves. What brought you to this charming little death trap in the middle of nowhere?" Rachel Williams, 16 and fierce in the way that only teenagers can be, appeared in the doorway with a baseball bat in her hands. "Get out of our house, you freak!" The stranger laughed with genuine delight. "Oh, I like her. She has spirit. That always makes things more interesting." "You're insane," Sarah whispered. "Am I?" The stranger tilted his head as if considering the question seriously. "Or am I simply more honest than most people? You see, I've learned something important during my travels. Humans are predators by nature. We've simply gotten very good at pretending otherwise." He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. Civilization is just a thin veneer painted over our true nature. Take away the laws, the social contracts, the fear of consequences, and what do you have? The same creatures that painted caves with the blood of their enemies and wore the teeth of their kills as jewelry. "You're sick," Robert said, edging toward the fireplace where a heavy iron poker waited. "I'm evolved," the stranger corrected. "I've embraced what I am instead of fighting it. The beast and I, we understand each other now. We've become integrated." As if to demonstrate his point, his fingers began to elongate slightly, nails extending into points that were too sharp to be entirely human. But the change stopped there, controlled and deliberate rather than the wild transformation that had marked his earlier visits. "You can change at will now," Sarah observed with growing horror. "Partial changes, yes. It took months to develop that level of control, but the benefits are substantial." He flexed his extended claws, examining them with obvious pride. "I no longer have to wait for the full moon to access my enhanced capabilities." Rachel swung the baseball bat at his head, putting all her teenage strength behind the blow. The stranger caught it one-handed without even looking in her direction, then crushed the aluminum barrel into a twisted spiral of metal. "Such enthusiasm," he said approvingly. "You'll be particularly entertaining when the time comes." For the next 2 hours, the stranger played with the Williams family like a cat toying with mice. He would allow them to think they'd found an escape route, then appear to block their path. He'd pretend to doze off, only to open his eyes the moment one of them tried to creep past him toward the door. It was psychological torture of the most refined sort, and he was clearly enjoying every moment of it. "Why are you doing this?" Robert finally asked, his voice hoarse from stress and fear. "Because I can," the stranger replied simply. "Because for the first time in my life, I'm exactly what I was meant to be. No more pretending to care about students who didn't want to learn. No more faculty meetings and budget committees and all the tedious minutiae of academic life. Just pure, honest existence." When the moon finally rose full and bright above the snow-covered mountains, the stranger's smile grew wider than any human face should be able to accommodate. "And now," he said, his voice already beginning to deepen and change, "the real fun begins." But this time, something was different. As the transformation took hold, the man's consciousness didn't disappear beneath the beast's hunger. Instead, both aspects of his nature worked together, human cunning combined with predatory instinct to create something more dangerous than either could be alone. The creature that stalked the Williams family through their own home was no longer driven by uncontrollable hunger. It was playing a game, and it was very, very good at it. Chapter 5. The Game. Marcus Chen had been living alone in the converted lighthouse on Widow's Point for 3 years, ever since his retirement from the Coast Guard. The isolation suited him perfectly after decades of dealing with maritime emergencies and bureaucratic red tape. His only regular visitor was Jenny Sullivan, the mail carrier who made the weekly trip up the winding coastal road to deliver his pension checks and the occasional package from his daughter in California. When the stranger appeared at his door on the night of the winter solstice, Marcus was cleaning his service pistol at the kitchen table, a ritual he performed every Tuesday evening with military precision. "Good evening, Marcus," the stranger said when the door opened. "Mind if I come in? It's frightfully cold out here." Marcus noticed immediately that the man knew his name, though they'd never met. He also noticed the confident way the stranger stood, as if he had no doubt he'd be invited inside. Most unsettling of all was the smile that never wavered, even when Marcus didn't immediately respond to his request. "Do I know you?" Marcus asked, keeping his hand near the pistol. "Not yet, but we're going to become very well acquainted." The stranger's smile grew wider, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp and too numerous for a human mouth. "My name is... well, that's not important anymore. What matters is that I've chosen you for a very special honor." "And what would that be?" "You're going to be my final hunt," the stranger said with obvious relish. "The culmination of months of practice and refinement. I've learned so much about the art of the kill, and you're going to help me perfect my technique." Marcus slammed the door and reached for his pistol, but the stranger was already inside somehow, moving with inhuman speed to position himself between Marcus and his weapon. "Ah," the stranger said, wagging one finger in mock disapproval. "That would spoil the game before it even begins. Besides, bullets are so pedestrian. Where's the sport in that?" Marcus had served 3 tours in Vietnam and 2 decades in the Coast Guard. He'd seen death in more forms than most people could imagine, and he recognized immediately that he was facing something beyond normal human experience. "What are you?" he asked. "I am evolution in action," the stranger replied. "The next step in human development. I am what our species could become if we stopped pretending that civilization was anything more than elaborate self-deception." The stranger began to pace around the lighthouse's main room, examining Marcus's modest possessions with the attention of an appraiser. "You know, I used to feel terrible about what I did. The first family I visited, I wept like a child. I apologized over and over, as if my regret could somehow minimize their suffering." He picked up a framed photograph of Marcus's daughter and her children, studying their faces with obvious interest. "But I've learned that remorse is just another form of self-indulgence. What matters isn't how the predator feels about the hunt. What matters is the purity of the experience itself." "You're insane." "I'm honest," the stranger corrected. "For the first time in my adult life, I'm being completely honest about what I am and what I want. The beast inside me doesn't lie or make excuses or pretend to be something it's not. It simply exists, and it's magnificent." He set the photograph down carefully, almost reverently. "Tonight, Marcus, you're going to help me achieve something truly special. Perfect integration between hunter and prey, predator and victim. We're going to dance together until only one of us remains. The stranger began to change, but slowly, deliberately, savoring each stage of the transformation. His bones lengthened with audible pops and cracks. His muscles expanded beneath clothes that tore away in carefully measured strips. His face elongated into something that belonged in nightmares, but his eyes remained disturbingly human. The others ran, the creature said, its voice now a deep rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They screamed and begged and tried to hide. But you're different, aren't you, Marcus? You're a warrior. You'll give me a proper fight. Marcus grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the side table and swung it at the creature's head. The blow that should have shattered a human skull barely made the monster flinch. But instead of retaliating immediately, the creature stepped back and applauded slowly. Excellent. Exactly the kind of spirit I was hoping for. This is going to be so much more satisfying than my previous encounters. For the next hour, the lighthouse became the arena for a deadly game of cat and mouse. The creature was clearly capable of ending Marcus's life at any moment, but it was holding back, prolonging the experience for its own entertainment. Marcus used every trick he'd learned in 3 decades of military and civilian service. He broke furniture to create weapons and barriers. He used the lighthouse's unique architecture to limit the creature's mobility. He even managed to wound it several times with improvised spears and blades. But with each passing minute, it became clear that the creature was simply playing with him, allowing him small victories to make the eventual defeat more satisfying. You're learning, the creature observed after Marcus managed to slash its arm with a broken piece of mirror, but I'm learning too. Your techniques, your strategies, your weaknesses. It's all so fascinating. That's when Marcus realized the true horror of his situation. The creature wasn't just hunting him for food or even for the thrill of the kill. It was studying him, analyzing his responses, cataloging his methods for future reference. You're using me, Marcus said, breathing hard as he backed up the lighthouse's spiral staircase. Of course I am, the creature replied, following at a leisurely pace. Every hunt teaches me something new about human behavior under extreme stress. You've been particularly educational, Marcus. Your military training has given you responses I haven't seen before. Why are you telling me this? Because the game is almost over, and I want you to understand how valuable your contribution has been. You've helped me become a more efficient predator, and for that, I'm genuinely grateful. At the top of the lighthouse, Marcus found himself trapped in the lamp room with nowhere else to run. The creature emerged from the stairwell with its impossible smile still firmly in place. Any last words? It asked with mock courtesy. Instead of answering, Marcus grabbed the heavy lighthouse lens and hurled it at the nearest window. The glass exploded outward, and freezing Atlantic air rushed into the room. Clever, the creature said appreciatively, but I'm afraid jumping would only save me the trouble of killing you myself. I'm not jumping, Marcus said, reaching for the emergency flare gun he kept mounted near the lamp controls. The flare struck the creature's center mass, erupting in brilliant red fire that filled the lamp room with smoke and flame. The monster's roar of surprise and pain was deafening, but Marcus was already moving, diving through the broken window into the icy darkness below. He hit the water hard, the impact driving the breath from his lungs and sending shockwaves of agony through his aging bones. But he was alive, and more importantly, he was free. Behind him, the lighthouse burned like a beacon against the winter sky. In the growing light of the flames, Marcus could see a dark shape moving in the lamp room, apparently unharmed by the fire. The creature appeared at the broken window, silhouetted against the flames, and Marcus could swear he heard laughter carrying across the water. Well played, Marcus, the creature called out. But the game isn't over yet. Marcus swam for shore with desperate strength, knowing that the creature could probably overtake him in the water if it chose to. But when he finally dragged himself onto the rocky beach and looked back, the lighthouse was empty. The creature was gone, vanished into the night to continue its twisted evolution somewhere else. And Marcus Chen, the only person to survive an encounter with the thing that had once been a philosophy professor, began the long walk towards civilization with the terrible knowledge that somewhere out there, the game was still being played. The werewolf was still learning, still growing more dangerous with each hunt, and next time, it might not be content with just one victim. The beast had tasted the thrill of the perfect hunt, and it was hungry for more.